I first heard today's guest, MALOU Innocent, at the Conference on World Affairs in Boulder, Colorado in 2009 on a panel entitled Iran, Be Nice to America or We'll Bring Democracy to Your Country Too. I found her to be well-informed, thoughtful, clear-thinking, articulate, persuasive. And then I checked her bio and discovered that she had graduated from college in 2005 and that she worked for the Cato Institute. And those two facts only added to my interest. I'd never really thought about whether Cato even did foreign policy, but I quickly filed MALOU Innocent among, quote, strange bedfellows. Now, I've been doing these interviews for over a decade, and I recently approached a publisher about a book that would be rooted in my take on things, but that would be really call on and be built on a foundation of all of the individuals that I've had the privilege to speak with over the years. And the publisher replied that for him to be interested in that book, I had to be clear about not just all these things people might say, but its overarching theme. Now, as anyone who listens to this program knows, I am by nature a generalist, and that I'm curious and passionate in my search for solutions to an awful lot of problems and concerns. I mean, what could be more eclectic and open-ended than what I say each week about the purpose of the show, that we're looking for pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. So I've been thinking about the publisher's question, and I don't have it fully answered, but one thing I do see: I'm not very interested in ideology. I'm not interested in predictable, habitual, easily categorized questions or answers. So I suspect that that sort of approach, that ideological, predictable approach, is dead. Now, by dead, sadly, I don't mean no longer popular or powerful. It certainly still is. The partisan, there's two sides to every question. Let's ask the left what they think, let's ask the right what they think, and so on, and have an argument. That certainly predominates, even when there is only one side that might be accurate, depending on the issue. But when I say dead, I mean that it's not alive. It's not creative. It's not really, I don't believe, capable of moving us toward a better future. Now, in that beyond ideology vein, MALOU Innocent's views can be found in the Huffington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and in Armed Forces Journal and Al Jazeera. So join us today as we talk about Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, the Middle East, and hopefully also the cost of foreign adventures on domestic well-being, the whole relationship of foreign policy to our domestic well-being here in the United States, and maybe even some issues in areas I haven't even thought of yet. Now, MALOU Innocent, she's a foreign policy analyst at the Cato Institute. She's a member of the International Institute of Strategic Studies. Her primary research interests include Middle East, Persian Gulf, security issues, U.S. foreign policy toward Pakistan, Afghanistan, China. Following dual Bachelor of Arts degrees in mass communications and political science at UC Berkeley, and then a Master of Arts in international relations from the University of Chicago, she's appeared as a guest analyst on CNN, BBC, Fox, Al Jazeera. See, I like the range there. She's published in journals such as Congressional Quarterly, Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, The Guardian, Huffington Post, and The Washington Times. Welcome, MALOU Innocent.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Terrence. It's so great to hear from you.
Great, great. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and the work we talk about. Now, let me ask you this one. It's about your path, because how have you ended up where you are at this point in your life? You're a published and featured foreign policy analyst for a prominent D.C. think tank, and you have crossover appeal. As I said, your opinions appear in the media in places that Cato probably doesn't show up all the time. How did that happen? What was your path?
It's interesting that you asked that. I think that overall my path began when I took a political theory course in undergrad. It was mostly examining 18th and 19th century political thinkers in Western Europe, and it really sort of got to the root of what do we deem to be political consent and legitimate governance. And sort of that got me thinking not only about the proper role of government, but also the proper role of our government abroad, and how it sort of uses the notion of sort of legitimate political aims or sort of magnanimous, noble intentions to sort of fuel support for wars abroad. And so for me, I think it started more in the philosophical realm of how do we analyze government power and how do we analyze the society's role vis-a-vis the state that really just got me started sort of thinking about government power itself. And I think overall, when we look at the way the political discourse is structured in the United States, it's unfortunate that there's sort of this dichotomy between the left and the right. I think that many Americans really have views that go beyond that dichotomy, whether you're talking about foreign policy, drug policy, civil liberties. There are many things that go beyond the simple left-right biases that we have, and that's perpetuated in a lot of the mainstream media. And I think that's sort of why, in many respects, Cato policies sometimes have crossover appeal, because it goes beyond these sort of structures that we've been used to. And I think going forward, hopefully, more people within the positions of power within Washington begin thinking a little differently and thinking more like the American people.
Right. Okay. So we're in sync on that one. And another question I was going to ask you was, when did you realize you were more interested in foreign policy than domestic? And you're saying that really it's sort of you looked at foreign policy as a result of domestic almost.
Yes, indeed. In fact, I think it was probably very young, actually, when I began watching a lot of, say, 2020, which is on ABC, watching a lot of Frontline News, watching a lot of BBC documentaries, watching things that sort of just expanded the sort of the realm of the world that I knew. And unlike some of my friends who were more interested in domestic issues or maybe California politics, which many of my friends still do and work on those issues, I was definitely more interested in what America was doing abroad, especially considering the fact that even today, many Americans can't place Afghanistan on an unmarked map. And so for me, it was especially intriguing, given the fact that we sort of go about our daily lives and we're sort of very detached from what our policymakers are doing in foreign countries.
Very good. Yeah, I think, certainly I think people wouldn't be able to find a lot of departments on a map as well, if you get what I mean. But certainly when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, one of the things, I did a show recently with a fellow from the New America Foundation, Stephen Hill, on his book Europe's Promise. And, he points out some interesting ways that not just European governments, but European corporations function differently than they do in the United States, things which I think would be very helpful over here. And the level of ignorance in this country about what happens in other countries as well as where they are is pretty profound. Let me throw something out there. Do you agree that that foreign and domestic are really interdependent, especially, as I was thinking about it in preparing for this, because of three things that are true now? When the spending of money and lives on military and empire inflicts collateral damage at home, in other words, when we're in the kind of economic straits we're in, then, does this amount of money we're spending, this amount overseas, become something we have to think about? Two, when it drains attention and robs us of focus and commitment on more valuable and sustainable challenges that we face here at home. When people see the news every day about Afghanistan or for so long about Iraq, and whatever attention they're throwing on, as you point out, 100,000 troops to battle 100 members of Al-Qaeda, then they perhaps don't have that attention or thoughtfulness to put on challenges with education, infrastructure, energy, any of those sort of things we face at home. And finally, when it distorts our economy and our politics in ways that handicap us versus other nations who don't spend this much money or attention on overseas adventures. Your thoughts? I
would agree. I mean, in fact, I think for the first portion, when you mentioned the economic components of war strategy and sort of the mission in general, many Americans just are completely unaware of what departments, as you mentioned earlier, the departments, the programs, the agencies that are integral to sort of perpetuating these sort of wars of aggression. And I think this was really highlighted in President Dwight Eisenhower's speech on the military-industrial complex. And it's odd that his assessment would be deemed radical today, but it's definitely very true. I mean, even many senators in Congress would state very openly and quite publicly that the only reason why they are committed to certain weapon systems and certain military platforms, or for essentially to keep working their citizens back in their districts. These are essentially public work programs. This is why I usually deride conservatives who talk about the welfare state. Well, what about the warfare state? And this is something that definitely sort of drains us slowly and gradually, but it's been of course, exponential after the course of these two campaigns in the Middle East, in Iraq, and Afghanistan.
And let me point out two things to piggyback on what you said. One is that defense contractors are very wise, and they will spread the wealth, if you will, of their contracts. There are bombers, for instance, that have jobs in 44 congressional districts. In other words, they make sure that they spread the people who get some bang from this buck all over the country. And then the second thing is that when you find that the Congress is unwilling to re-up on unemployment benefits or any more money for jobs, when you call them straight jobs, and yet they will fund the military, considering it at some level a jobs program, that the actual number of people who get money, that defense contracting is a very inefficient way to fund jobs.
Absolutely, and I think that's something that many Americans, unfortunately, don't understand or just completely are ignorant of. But I think, of course, when you look at those Americans who are in the know, who do read the newspaper, who do seek out forms of information independent of the mainstream media, they do understand that dynamic. And I think going forward, we can sort of spread that information to others. But related to the second notion that you mentioned earlier about sort of the political problems involved, I mean, this is very much a situation that's similar to the drug policy, in the sense that the drug war has failed tremendously over the past 30 or 40 years since it's been implemented, but no policymaker in their right mind is willing to countenance repealing our offensive drug war policies, simply because it would be political suicide. And I think the same applies to the sort of the war on terror, quote unquote, and fighting wars. Democrats are reamed repeatedly for being weak on terrorism, even
or soft on crime. Yeah,
or soft on crime
for the war on drugs, exactly.
Absolutely, or even though many of the policies that others endorse, such as the hawks, such as the conservatives, such as the neoconservatives, actually promote a greater radicalization in the Muslim world that actually provokes more terrorist attacks against the United States. And so even though we do have sound and rational policy alternatives, many times we get trapped in these domestic political debates that essentially don't bring us forward and don't bring about the best policies.
Very good. I couldn't agree more. Let's talk about Afghanistan first. I read that you had recently returned. Am I correct?
Yes, in May.
In May. Okay. So you also recently wrote when the McChrystal brouhaha happened and the transfer, his exit and Petraeus' move into that position and so on. You wrote a piece called 5 Basic Reasons the U.S. Doesn't Need to Be in Afghanistan. Those 5 basic reasons?
Well, I think the first basic reason, and the most essential, I think, is that remaining in Afghanistan is not vital to U.S. national security. And this is somewhat related to what we talked about earlier, in the sense that many Americans can't place Afghanistan on an unmarked map. Now, of course, we're living in the 21st century. We're definitely in a more globalized environment, and Americans would be helped if they knew more about the world. But at the same time, the fact that Americans don't know enough about Afghanistan reinforces my overall point, which is that if the administration has to sell a war, if they have to spin the war and propagandize a war, then that sort of proves that it doesn't pose an existential threat to the United States. Our leaders don't need to sort of whip up fervor for war if that country in question does not necessarily pose a threat to the United States. And I think the fact that we sort of ignored Afghanistan shows that we don't really need to be there. As far as the second reason why, and I think one of the basic reasons why we must sort of refocus on Afghanistan and the policies and not just focus on who's the head of Central Command or who's the head of the commanding operations in Afghanistan, is that Pakistan is also a sort of a critical function in this region, not only because it funds and assists the Taliban, but also because what I've noticed is that a lot of the militancy in Afghanistan and a lot of the military operations in Afghanistan are pouring over the border and destabilizing Pakistan, even though that's one of the many reasons that policymakers offer for why we should remain in the region. So this is sort of one of the things that actually refutes the contention that policymakers and lawmakers always make, which is that we must remain in Afghanistan to save Pakistan, even though our presence in Afghanistan is actually fueling support for indigenous militants within Pakistan.
Right. We'll talk more about. The way I sort of look at this is we'll talk Afghanistan, we'll talk Pakistan, we'll talk some others, but so we'll get into that in a little more detail. More basic reasons we don't need to be there.
No, well, I forget the
okay.
ordering
Okay.
exactly.
I'm sorry to do that for you, but I think one of them, if you don't cite it exactly in that, is when Leon Panetta and others basically admit that we might be down to as many as 100 members of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, a country of 30 million, and we have 100,000 troops and at least that many contractors there.
Oh, indeed. Yes, and I think we sort of just lost sight of the mission, and this sort of gets to the problem of the notion that we must create a government in Afghanistan, a nationalized government. And this is really sort of a top-down approach that's undone rulers in Afghanistan, both foreign and domestic, in the past. We've gotten far removed from the initial reasons for the invasion, the initial campaign, which is to go after the Al-Qaeda organization responsible for 9/11.
Right. In other words, if I may, except for nailing bin Laden himself, which we had the opportunity to do and frittered away in the earliest stages of this war, we could very well declare victory and go home if we were basing it on our original reasons for going there.
Absolutely. And I think this is sort of the problem now is that many people say, oh, we should have committed even more to Afghanistan in 01 and 02 and 03. But there's a problem with that. I mean, we still have the basic notion that we can create a unified, democratic, non-corrupt, stable electoral democracy in Afghanistan where one has never existed. There certainly have been centralized governments in Afghanistan, but those were indigenous bottom-up movements and not one completely bankrolled and sponsored by a foreign power. And so I think in that sense, we could use that original blueprint in 2001 to go after Al-Qaeda in the future. We don't necessarily have to hunker down and remain and have a long-term troop presence for something that essentially can be done with through special operations forces and ongoing surveillance and cooperation. But then going back to sort of the five main reasons, aside from Pakistan, aside from the viable national state that people talk about, aside from the sort of the importance of Afghanistan itself, I think another thing we've sort of missed is that remaining in Afghanistan, remaining in sort of this prolonged guerrilla war weakens the United States both economically and militarily. We sort of addressed this earlier, but I think it's worth sort of highlighting the extent to which the billions of dollars that have been spent abroad. I think there are legitimate arguments. I don't necessarily agree with it wholeheartedly, but you can make legitimate claims that that money should be spent at home rather than in Afghanistan, paving roads, building schools, policing tribal districts, and retooling communal identities. I think again we sort of lost sight of the original sense of the mission, and we sort of begin to become social engineers in this part of the world.
Let me talk a little bit about what's going on over there. On the 28th of June, I think. I'm not quite sure of the date, but Dexter Filkins wrote in the New York Times, this was more recent than that, overture to Taliban jolts Afghan minorities. Okay, the leaders of the countries, I'm quoting from his article, the leaders of the country's Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara communities, which make up close to half of Afghanistan's population, are vowing to resist and, if necessary, fight any deal that involves bringing members of the Taliban insurgency into a power-sharing arrangement with the government. One of them, an Uzbek member of parliament and once a member of the anti-Taliban militia, says Karzai is giving Afghanistan back to the Taliban. He's opening up the old schisms. If he wants to bring in the Taliban and they begin to use force, we will go back to civil war and Afghanistan will be split. Matthew Ho, the foreign service officer who resigned during that period when Obama was considering what to do about Afghanistan, and I had him on the show, and he basically says that Afghanistan is to a great extent a civil war, not just between tribes or ethnicities, but even between the past and modernity. So talk a little bit about these the ethnic makeup and what's really at play there.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely Afghanistan is divided ethnically, religiously, and also not just ethnically and physically, but also just geographically in terms of the predominant groups within Afghanistan, such as the Pashtuns. A majority of them are actually lying in Pakistan. So you see that various countries, including Pakistan and also with Iran, with the Baluchis, also in the north with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, many countries surrounding Afghanistan have ethnic groups that also pour across the border and into Afghanistan. Afghanistan. Historically, these countries have used the ethnic groups within Afghanistan to exploit and to extend their own geopolitical influence within Afghanistan. And that's sort of been the overarching history of Afghanistan, is that it's sort of been meddled with by the surrounding states and has never been able to sort of create its own indigenous government. And when it has, it's usually been very short-term, maybe over a course of a quarter of a century or so, but nothing really truly long-term. And I think we saw that again in sort of the 1990s, where you had ethnic Uzbek and Tajik factions that were fighting against the Pashtun-dominated Taliban. And on the one side, with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, you saw them materially supported by India, by Iran, by Russia, by Tajikistan. And on the other side, with the Pashtuns, you saw them backed by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And so sort of that civil war aspect is definitely true, but it's almost a broader regional civil war that plays out in Afghanistan. And I think, moreover, as getting to what Matthew Ho mentioned, it's not just an ethnic civil war as well. It's also a sort of a societal civil war. You have more of the urban, educated elite who definitely want the American presence in Afghanistan. They want to create a sort of democratic, non-corrupt government for their country. But in many areas of the rural areas of the country, where 3/4 of the population live, they're definitely much more conservative. Many more of them are illiterate. They're certainly not as cosmopolitan as those in the urban areas, and they strongly resist the foreign troop presence. And so sort of the notion that the United States or its international partners can create one government that everyone will like and everyone will accept is very far-fetched, given the divisions that exist in the country, and also the fact that even if you bring, say, one faction to the negotiating table, there might be another side that would reject it outright, as we've seen, as you mentioned recently, with the New York Times piece.
The notion that we referred to the problems that it creates, but the notion that any exit by the U.S. may need negotiations with the Taliban, because otherwise you have an insurgency that can probably, whack-a-mole, pop up here, calm down there, pop up there, and go on forever, that to actually try to have any movement will call for negotiating with the Taliban, bring them into the government. Your sense of where that sits right now, whether it's being done and what the repercussions might be.
It should be prepared to make peace with the Taliban, and not simply the low-level foot soldiers, but also the senior leadership, simply because even though the Taliban did provide a safe haven to al-Qaeda, it wasn't necessarily responsible for 9/11. It's not posing an existential threat to the United States. These are mostly indigenous, Pashtun-dominated groups that essentially won't pose any threat either to U.S. interests or will they swim over and attack us here in the United States. So I think overall we should be able to want to negotiate with them, but I do think it is sort of problematic to begin thinking that that's the way out. I don't think our exit is contingent on whether or not we create a sort of a negotiated settlement with the Taliban, only because it extends and it shifts the goalposts. We sort of noticed this during the Iraq War, when there was always a new rationale for why we must remain, why we must stay the course, why there's another corner turned. And what I'm worried about with sort of peace talks with the Taliban is that obviously any sort of talks would demand implicitly conditions that the Taliban would have to meet and have to fulfill. But there's no assurance that we can either maintain or that they will adhere to protecting an agreement once reached, because, of course, how are those peace terms going to be enforced?
And let me jump in for a second. Wasn't part of the when Obama finally, after those deliberations, sided with McChrystal and Petraeus and so on for this Afghanistan surge, wasn't the notion that if we hope to begin to come home in 2011, that we're going to have to begin to negotiate with the Taliban? And so the goal was, if I'm not mistaken, for this surge to weaken the Taliban so that we would be in a stronger negotiating position.
Absolutely. That was the implicit notion, that was the assumption that the coalition had and that the administration had, which is that we must weaken the Taliban's momentum on the ground, and that would essentially force the senior leadership to the negotiation table. Now, the problem with this, of course, is twofold. Number one, it assumes that we can defeat the on the ground, and number two, it assumes that if they are defeated, that they'd be willing to negotiate with us. And I think overall, even if we do pursue a political settlement, which I do believe is much more feasible than a military approach, even then, even if we do the political settlement, there are a host of problems. But I think even if we do that, we have to go through Pakistan. Pakistan does wield a great deal of influence over many of the insurgent networks that are destabilizing Afghanistan for their own strategic ambitions and ends. And whether we're talking about the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar network, whether we're talking about the Afghan Taliban, whether we're talking about the Haqqani network, various groups that do hold a great deal of sway in the eastern and southern portions of the country, they will have to be brought in only through Pakistan. They do wield a great deal of influence. And I think recently we saw this with the resignation of the interior minister and also the head of Afghan intelligence in Afghanistan, because they were seen as obstacles to any sort of peace with Pakistan. So we might be seeing a little bit of leaders in Kabul making overtures to Islamabad, trying to hammer out their own political settlement. And I'm not sure to what extent the United States is involved, but I'm worried at least that the United States is not getting involved enough, in the sense that any sort of negotiated settlement would have to either reopen the Constitution, will have to reopen sort of to what extent will these groups, will these networks, how much they'll have sway and political control within Kabul. Will they be sort of a Central Asian version of Hezbollah? Will they be a political movement attached with a sort of a paramilitary wing? We haven't even opened that door yet. Right now, still President Obama is committed to, again, weakening the insurgency on the ground rather than opening up a diplomatic rapprochement with these militants. But again, I mean, given the sort of problematic nature of negotiations, given how long they would take, I would hope that they would begin now rather than waiting a year from now and sort of waiting essentially to see what will happen.
It's been my assumption that they probably have begun and that they're just back channel at this point. That's just my assumption. But the other thing that I just want to... What?
In fact, I'm sorry to interrupt, Terrence. No, I mean, I would agree. I mean, what's funny is that when we opened up negotiations with China, communist China, back in the early 70s, that was on hold and sort of in the behind closed doors for about 3 or 4 years. Not even Secretary of State William Rogers was aware that this was happening because it was so secret. So I would almost hope that there's something now that's beyond the scenes, beyond sort of the photo opportunities,
right,
beyond, sort of the headlines, that actually would create a way to hammer out a lot of the difficult situations.
Yeah. Let me just make 2 other points about Afghanistan, and then we'll move on. One is that a point that you referred to, but we haven't hit hard, is that what seems to happen, not only does the goal line get moved and blurred, but the opponent consistently gets blurred. It's not unlike when it served the Bush-Cheney administration to blur Al-Qaeda and Saddam. For the current blurring, which it seems to me you find Al-Qaeda and Taliban, somehow they're almost identical at certain times when people are talking about them. And this is, as you point out often in your writing and your speaking, this is not the case. So that's just one thing. And the second thing is the premise that we're talking about in terms of the current Obama strategy, which is weaken the insurgency and then negotiate. We haven't mentioned that the weakening the insurgency part hasn't been working out very well either.
Absolutely. And in fact, I'm happy you raised those 2 important points. The first being that, yes, we've sort of shifted the goalpost by saying that the Taliban is now our enemy. In a sense, the Al-Qaeda network that was responsible for 9/11, they're a transnational jihadist network. They exist on the Internet. They're mostly Arab-based. They're not necessarily Pashtun at all. And yet they've sort of been lumped with the indigenous Pashtun-dominated movement known as the Taliban and other indigenous networks of militants that pose no essential threat to the United States. And I think, of course, it reflects in some way the shifting goalposts, the sort of mission creep that we've seen over the past almost decade now of war in Afghanistan. But it also shines a harsh light on what is essentially perceived by many Afghans to be a blatantly hypocritical U.S. policy, in the sense that there are many officials, warlords, drug kingpin criminals that make up the Afghan parliament that we've turned a blind eye to and we willingly support. I think even at least half of the lower level of the Afghan parliament is full of fundamentalists. And yet these people who are also responsible for human rights abuses, who've been appointed government positions within Karzai's administration, they are responsible for just as much slaughtering as the Taliban. But because they helped us oust the Taliban, they're all of a sudden not our enemies. And we, in many respects, you see this sort of policy, this contradiction within other areas of the world as well. I mean, we don't really look at how Saudi Arabia, which is a staunch U.S. ally, so quote unquote, treats its women. The women there, if they're accused of adultery, they're flogged in public. They can't vote, they can't drive, they're denied basic human rights. And so in many respects, I think we see sort of an overall sort of hypocritical policy of if an enemy comes along our side, if they believe what we do, if they toe our line, then they offered billions of dollars in U.S. support.
Well, if anyone watches these things historically, they remember that Saddam was our dictator for a while. Noriega was our dictator for a while. That these people actually, when it serves our purposes, they're ours, and then we somehow marshal that they are the reincarnation of Satan and worthy of our national defense going against them.
There was Saddam Hussein was Hitler.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Today's New York Times has a big story entitled "Is Yemen the next Afghanistan?" Is it?
Well, according to the Coindinistas, as some people, such as myself, refer to them as, yes, it will be, only because a lot of people within Washington believe that the ungoverned parts of the world pose a threat in and of themselves because militants and terrorists can emerge from these areas and attack the United States. And so for Yemen, at least for the position of these people, we must sort of create a centralized government. Sort of this, this almost writes itself. It's so sad. It's so absurd.
It's so predictable. Yes.
Absolutely. And it's been written before with Afghanistan. It's been written before with Iraq. And now people are trying to do the same thing with Pakistan now, and as well as with Yemen and Somalia, and the list goes on.
Yep.
But this notion that ungoverned or failed states pose threats in and of themselves is something that sort of masks a deeper problem, which is that a history of U.S. intervention in these regions creates the United States as the enemy number one, whereas before these sort of foreign civil conflicts would be breeding grounds for their own sort of instability, they all of a sudden become a threat to the United States once America becomes involved. It's almost a vortex.
Right.
We begin to sort of pull our attention towards, and then we push in resources, and then it sort of sucks us in.
Yeah, and let me see if you agree with me. I mean, obviously, if you begin to create a foreign policy based on what Barnett calls the gap, the ones that are these failed states and so on. I mean, if you wanted to take a world map and say, where are the intractable problems, where if we get involved, we will never be able to define success or an exit strategy, they're like the perfect candidate for that.
Absolutely. I mean, this rationale creates the sort of assumptions that allow us to have repeated interventions abroad. There is no chance at all that the United States will ever not be at war under such a policy.
That's exactly right. And nor will it ever succeed.
Right, exactly. And in fact, and this sort of gets to I think the fifth sort of basic issue that I mentioned in that op-ed, which is that these unending wars of occupation, these guerrilla insurgencies that we're fighting, we feed al-Qaeda's narrative. Their narrative is that the United States is attacking the Muslim world, that, we see ourselves in Afghanistan and Iraq and in Pakistan. We're saber-rattling with Iran. Now we're talking about Yemen and Somalia. I mean, you do get the sort of notion, if you were on the other side, that the United States is attacking Islam. And so going forward, at least, even the notion that we can surge more troops and that'll win hearts and minds, what sort of narrative are we feeding into, especially when you consider that the longer we remain in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the more it'll likely increase the incentive for these groups to unite in a common cause against what they perceive to be a foreign occupation of their region. But getting back earlier to something you mentioned, I wasn't unable to sort of answer earlier as far as are we weakening the insurgency?
Mm-hmm.
In many areas we're not. In fact, it's sort of a disturbing trend where we see the more troops we pour in, the more instability has increased. Especially when you look at Marja,
right.
The recent offensive in southern Afghanistan and Helmand province, where before the offensive, the Taliban, of course, they were repressive and what have you, but they did provide a rudimentary level of basic justice, of security security for locals. They didn't tamper with the local opium economy. And then all of a sudden, when the NATO forces went in, there was no judicial system in place to jail suspected Taliban insurgents. The ANA was rife with its own issues and problems. Many of the local people hated the police as much as the Taliban. And so there are all these sort of issues that we have with insurgency, the sort of government in a box approach that counterinsurgents want to put forth in Afghanistan. And we can't make a government. We cannot make a government. We cannot create progress. And these things arise organically and indigenously from the bottom up. And even in these areas that we considered ungoverned, such as the areas of Pakistan, Afghanistan, they're not ungoverned per se. They simply don't have Western standards of government and democracy and due process. But they definitely have their own traditional and local customs that allow for the arbitration of disputes. And unfortunately, some of those areas have been weakened as a result of the war that we were funding, the Afghan-Soviet jihad in the 1980s. And so again, you see where the United States does become involved. Where we do pour in resources, where you see the slow degradation of local and traditional customs.
Right. In other words, when you begin to say your way of, however you're doing it locally isn't good enough for us, we're going to destroy that and hopefully help you build up a national one, this seems to me to be definitely a fool's errand. What and how are we doing in Pakistan right now?
It's interesting you mentioned that. I wouldn't say that we're doing too well as far as our public image is concerned. Most Pakistani citizens and most of the Pakistani elite consider the United States to be a bigger threat to them than Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Even though they do believe they are a threat, they do believe that the foreign troop presence is a bigger threat to their country. And in fact, since 9/11, you've seen a steady increase in the amount of insecurity and bombings and violence in major Pakistani cities. Even in Lahore, which was once a very peaceful city in the heartland in Punjab, they've been rocked over the past several years by militants, by jihadist thugs, by sort of these militant groups. And many of Pakistanis, for understandable reasons, attribute the foreign troop presence next door as a result of that. And I would say the same, and many other analysts would say the same as well, that you see a great deal of these indigenous militant groups along the tribal region that are sort of stirred up as a result of not only drone attacks but also the foreign troop presence, a lot of the insurgency and the instabilities being poured over the border. And sort of a way to understand the border, at least the way I look at it, it's almost like a balloon or like a waterbed. Mm-hmm. Push down on one side and the militants go to the other. They don't necessarily go anywhere. They're not killed or anything. They actually just simply move to the other side. And so that's sort of one thing that we've seen is that whenever the Pakistani military has an operation in, say, Bajour Agency or in any of the tribal areas, then many of those militants filter onto the other side and vice versa. And so for many within Pakistan, they see the foreign troop presence and the NATO presence as inherently destabilizing. And also we haven't really gotten a great deal of their support for two reasons. One, because of our history in the region, which is essentially promising the Pakistanis a lot in terms of security commitments and defense arrangements and then not delivering. And then also because of the increased Indian involvement we've been seeing in Afghanistan. Not only has the Indians been giving billions of dollars to the Afghan government in Kabul, but there are also numerous consulates that are springing up around Afghanistan that many Pakistani military officials claim allow India to sort of fund the Baluchi insurgency within Pakistan, that they're assisting in some way, shape, or form the militants that are destabilizing Pakistan, and of course Indian officials reject that notion. But then you have the real sort of problem that this creates a reluctance on the part of the Pakistanis to cooperate with the United States because they've essentially given their enemy a Western flank to attack them.
Mm-hmm. And the Northern Alliance, which is the side that we chose in 2001 when we went into Afghanistan, is basically a India-leaning versus a Pakistan-leaning ethnic group?
Exactly. In fact, the Northern Alliance was a group that early on, even as early as October 2001, when then President Musharraf said, if the Northern Alliance is in a seat in Kabul, is in a seat in power in Kabul, that Pakistanis will reject this. And this is this very sort of entity that we relied on to oust the Taliban leadership. And nevertheless, as we go forward, we persist in this conviction that we need the Northern Alliance and we need sort of these power brokers behind Kabul and behind Karzai, simply because, again, we have this notion that we must create a centralized government. All of this surrounds this notion of a centralized government, and it's so problematic given the history of the country, given the ethnic fissures, that not one group will agree to sort of what we have set in mind. There will always be people who will be left out of the power-sharing arrangement, and this is, again, sort of a major, large-scale social engineering project we're employing.
Right. So as much as the the exit strategy, the definition of success and all is vague and movable, it does seem to consistently come back to this thing of a national democratic government, which, based on just Afghanistan, is an unwinnable, an impossibility for all intents and purposes. And so everything that falls backward from that, whether it's alliances with the wrong groups and so on, it just seems so ridiculous. Let me ask one last thing here about this. The June report from the London School of Economics that Pakistan's main spy agency continues to arm and train the Taliban and is even represented on the group's leadership council. Speak about that.
Well, what's interesting is that for the Pakistanis, especially within the military and the military-dominated intelligence agency, Inter-Services Intelligence, ISI, they really do believe that funding violent jihadist groups is essential to their national security. And they do this not for ideological reasons per se, but because they believe that these groups are a means to secure and expand their regional interests vis-a-vis India and also within Afghanistan. So we're talking about Kashmir. They use various insurgent groups within Afghanistan. They use various insurgent groups. And so I unfortunately see this as a crucial stumbling block for the United States. There is very little the United States can do to compel Pakistan to stop supporting these groups. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, because of the profound levels of distrust that have been built up over the decades, in the sense that no Pakistani leader in their right mind would want to relinquish what they consider to be a national security outlet for essentially a fair weather friend. And secondly, given the sort of the entrenchment that India has had within Afghanistan, for many within Pakistan, they're sandwiched on both sides by a demographically, economically, and militarily more powerful enemy. And so for them, relinquishing support to the Taliban, they would never countenance such a thing. So I think overall, if we want to try and move more toward a political settlement, we would have to bring Pakistan to the negotiation table. It won't be easy, of course, because India would, of course, object to any sort of Taliban-controlled regime or any sort of regime that has any semblance of Taliban control. But again, if we're sort of focused on what is crucial to U.S. interests, if we're focused simply on the al-Qaeda threat, that is something we must move forward on, which is a regional diplomatic approach to this. And sort of compelling Pakistan to stop funding militants, that'll be definitely a long road ahead. We've already been in Afghanistan almost a decade now, and Pakistan has essentially said that they are continuing their support for funding these militants because they believe it is a sort of a crucial instrument of their foreign policy.
Let me ask you, in the about 5 minutes we have left, to take a bigger picture, step back, take a bigger picture. It looks to me like one of the crucial problems in American society these days is a very bad sense of incentives and risks. And I would say that with Enron and all those things that happened in the dot-com crash, we certainly saw that people just risking way beyond where they should, and incentives pushing people to push the envelope way beyond what was going to work. The Iraq War was sold on a best-case scenario. They will greet us as liberators. It will be a short war. We will put a flag of democracy in the middle of the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. All best-case scenario, and you end up engaging actually in a preemptive war on a best-case scenario justification seems to me it's not just insane, it's unconscionable. The Wall Street crash, again, was a up and down, a misinterpretation of risk and a misallocation of incentives This seems to me to say we as a society are in big trouble. Now, I'm asking you to jump a little bit out of your foreign policy, but it's the same thing. I think one could use the same misuse of those two concepts in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in the Middle East, etc. What's going on with our sense of risk and sort of being prudent and actually being strategic in the world?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you mentioned that, and I do think it applies to foreign policy. It's sort of this weird contradiction where our leaders tell us that, we will be demolished by al-Qaeda-like figures. We're constantly on high alert. We're constantly in fear of another terrorist attack. We're so weak. We're so this and that. But at the same time, in the same breath, they say, we can create a unified democratic country abroad. They look at the fact that we spend more than the rest of the world combined on military expenditures, the fact that we are the global superpower. And so in one sense, they say that we are so weak that the Western civilization will collapse if al-Qaeda gets, say, a nuclear weapon. And they sort of create these risks that are so hyperbolic and so in the extreme, in the realm of possibility. And in the same breath, they say that we are so powerful, we are so great, we are capable of all these things. And sort of the American public is left wondering, I think, number one, how on earth can these things be compatible, given the fact that when we look at Iraq and when we look at Afghanistan, we are failing in that regard to create a sort of centralized national government in our image. And number two, why is it that our security must be immediately sort of reconciled with by creating these countries abroad? And I think overall, when we look at the risks of sort of terrorism and the incentives that push us to war, they're almost in lockstep because you have many people in the administration, many people who are in Congress who, again, what we talked about earlier, they have special privileges and special interests and powerful interests that profit at the expense of war. And it's very much a cynical way to look at it, but it's definitely the way it is, and it's not conspiratorial at all. Again, many leaders are very open about the extent to which the war that we have right now and the war that we have in Afghanistan and Iraq is essentially a sort of privatized defense industrial complex that allows us to sort of generate jobs, generate growth. In fact, just recently, President Bush said that the wars actually increase their economic output. They help the economy. And so you see sort of the intertwining of both risks and incentives when it comes to war and when it comes to foreign policy. And you see these sort of al-Qaeda boogeymen being held up as these...
Well, isn't that the Dick Cheney 1% theory,
right.
philosophy,
the 1%
right?
Doctrine.
Yeah.
If something is 1% likely to occur, and we have to act as if it was 100% likely.
Right, and then on the other hand, he was the one most promoting the best case scenario about the outcome of acting on that 1% possibility.
Exactly.
It's just it's insanity.
It's insanity. And when you look at a country like Afghanistan, you asked earlier about are we weakening the insurgency? What's funny is that, you don't know whether to laugh or cry sometimes. The Taliban have a saying, you Westerners have all the watches. We Taliban have all the time. And they're dealing with an enemy with a guerrilla force that melts easily back with the population. They have a cross-border sanctuary. They've been able to defeat...
I've got to end it there.
Absolutely, no worries.
I've been speaking with MALOU Innocent. She's a foreign policy analyst at the Cato Institute. She's recently returned from Afghanistan. As we said, you can learn more at Cato, Cato.org, and then just look for MALOU Innocent. And at a lot of the other sites she regularly contributes to, including the Huffington Post and alternate.org. Thank you, MALOU Innocent. Keep up the good work.